From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Until people hear about what is going on with this war, it will continue to happen and people will continue to die. I am sorry for the things that I did. I am no longer the monster that I once was. Thank you.
Former Marine John Turner, winter soldier. U.S. veterans and active duty soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan gathered in Maryland this weekend to testify about the horrors of war. While the corporate media ignored the story, we'll broadcast their voices. Then this weekend also marked the 40th anniversary of the My Lai massacre, when U.S. troops killed more than 500 men, women, and children in Vietnam. We'll speak with investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the killings and the cover-up. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Federal Reserve took dramatic action last night on multiple fronts to avert a crisis of the global financial system. On Sunday, the Fed helped J.P. Morgan purchase the investment bank Bear Stearns in an effort to save the nation's fifth-largest investment bank from collapse. The Fed also announced an emergency quarter-point cut in its discount rate. It's also agreed to become the lender of last resort for other investment banks in an effort to prevent firms from going under. The Wall Street Journal reports this marks one of the broadest expansions of the Fed's lending authority since the 1930s. The fall of Bear Stearns has shocked the business community. J.P. Morgan bought the company for just $270 million. A year ago, Bear Stearns was valued at $20 billion. As part of the deal, the Federal Reserve agreed to lend J.P. Morgan $30 billion to secure some of Bear Stearns' mortgage investments. If the assets decline in value, the U.S. taxpayer will bear the cost. The government-led bailout is the first of its kind since the Great Depression. In response to the bailout of Bear Stearns, stock markets in Asia and Europe tumbled. Meanwhile, the price of oil has jumped to a new all-time high, nearly $112 a barrel. While more than 70% of economists now believe the nation is in a recession, President Bush continues to insist the foundation of the economy is solid. He spoke Friday at the Economic Club of New York.
So I'm coming to you as an optimistic fellow. I've seen what happens when America deals with difficulty. I believe that we're a resilient economy. And I believe that the ingenuity and resolve of the American people is what helps us deal with these issues, and it's going to happen again.
Also on Friday, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson defended the Federal Reserve's efforts to bail out Bear Stearns.
I think we made the right decision. I think the Federal Reserve made the right decision here. And again, I don't know what to say other than what I've just said is we've got strong financial institutions. Our markets are the envy of the world. They're resilient. They're innovative. They're flexible. I think we move very quickly to address situations in this country.
In other economic developments, new government statistics confirm what many grocery store shoppers already know. Food prices are soaring. In the past year, the price of milk has risen 17%. Rice, pasta, and bread prices have jumped over 12%, and the price of eggs has risen by 25%. It's the highest grocery inflation since the early 1990s. In world news, over 80 people are feared dead in Tibet following a wave of anti-government protests against Chinese rule. Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, accused China of waging cultural genocide. Protests began a week ago when Buddhist monks took to the streets of Lhasa to mark the anniversary of the 1959 uprising against Chinese rule. Protests then spread to other Chinese provinces with Tibetan populations. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers are now patrolling Lhasa following an outbreak of violence on Friday when Tibetan protesters set fire to Chinese-owned shops. China has issued an ultimatum to protesters to surrender by midnight tonight or face harsh punishment. The Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy reports hundreds of Tibetans have already been arrested. China has also barred foreign reporters from Tibet and blocked access to many websites, including YouTube, where video of the protests have been posted over the past week. The demonstrations come less than 200 days before the start of the Summer Olympics in Beijing. Tibetans living in exile have been holding protests across the globe. In New York, several hundred Tibetans and supporters gathered outside the Chinese consulate on Saturday.
Struggling to get freedom and independence for our country for 50 years with the peaceful means or non-violence, and there is not much, no fruitful result for it. So, and I think if this problem is not resolved soon, there'll be a different approach from the youngsters, because the youngsters are getting frustrated.
Another protester criticized China's human rights record.
We don't want the Chinese to get away with all the things that they're doing in their own country. I mean, it's not only in Tibet. In China, their own people don't have that freedom. And also, they are influencing, in Dhaka, they're talking about the Chinese influence there, too. I mean, they are affecting people all over the world, and not in a good way. And that's what we think of when we think of Olympics. We want it to go to a nation that appreciates basic human rights.
In news from Iraq, Senator John McCain and Vice President Dick Cheney have made separate, unannounced visits to Iraq ahead of the 5th anniversary of the U.S. invasion. McCain claimed his visit was a fact-finding venture, not a campaign photo opportunity. Cheney's on a 10-day visit to the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, the West Bank, and Turkey. Cheney started his trip on Sunday exactly 5 years after he predicted the U.S. will be greeted in Iraq as, quote, liberators, a claim John McCain later supported. Meanwhile, a new survey has found more than two-thirds of Iraqis believe U.S.-led coalition forces should leave. A quarter of those surveyed said they'd lost a family member to murder since the war began. President Bush told U.S. troops in Afghanistan he was, quote, a little envious of them. In a video conference last week, Bush said, quote, if I were slightly younger and not employed here, I think it would be a fantastic experience to be on the front lines of helping this young democracy succeed. Bush went on to say, quote, it must be exciting for you, in some ways romantic, in some ways, you know, confronting danger. You're really making history, and thanks. In news from Capitol Hill, the House has voted to reject giving telecommunications companies immunity for participating in the government's warrantless wiretapping program. By a 213 to 197 vote, the Democratic-led House passed the measure despite a threatened veto by President Bush. U.S. officials have admitted the CIA has been holding an Afghan man named Mohammed Rahim in a secret overseas prison. Last week, Rahim was transferred to the military prison at Guantanamo. The Bush administration has refused to say where they captured Rahim or where he's been held. He's accused of being a member of al-Qaeda and a translator for Osama bin Laden. In Richmond, California, 24 activists were arrested Saturday at demonstrations outside a Chevron oil refinery. Protesters criticized Chevron's plan to upgrade the refinery as well as the war in Iraq. At the rally, Richmond Mayor Gail McLaughlin told the crowd, it's time to clear the air and say no more pollution, no more war, and no more lies. And Sunday marked the 5th anniversary of the death of Rachel Corrie. On March 16, 2003, an Israeli military bulldozer crushed Corrie to death as she tried to stop the demolition of a home of a Palestinian pharmacist in the Gaza town of Rafah. Eyewitnesses said Rachel was standing directly in the path of the bulldozer holding a megaphone wearing a fluorescent jacket. She was 23 years old. On Sunday, the play My Name is Rachel Corrie was performed for the first time in Israel. The play was performed in Arabic in the Israeli city of Haifa. It's scheduled to tour Israel and the occupied West Bank. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans gathered in Maryland this past weekend to testify at Winter Soldier, an eyewitness indictment of atrocities committed by U.S. troops during the ongoing occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Organized by Iraq Veterans Against the War, the event was modeled after the historic 1971 Winter Soldier hearings held during the Vietnam War. over the weekend. War veterans spoke of free fire zones, the shootings and beatings of innocent civilians